everyone, welcome to our next chapter book that we will be reading together, The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. I am very excited about this one. This one always makes me think of winter and cold and sometimes Christmas. So let's get into it. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 1. Lucy looks into a wardrobe. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to a house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into the story much. He himself was a very old man with a shaggy white hair which grew over most of his face, as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once. But the first evening, when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him. And Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said goodnight to the professor and gone upstairs, the first night the boys came into the girls' room and they all started talking it over. "We've fallen on our feet and no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that." "Like what?" said Susan. "And anyway, it's time you were in bed." "Trying to talk like mother," said Edmund. "And who are you to say when I'm to go to bed? Go to bed yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I'll tell you, this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes' walk from here down to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between." "What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading into empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along? And the woods? There might be eagles. There might be stags. There'll definitely be hawks." "Badgers?" said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. But when next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out the window, you could see neither the mountains, nor the woods, nor even the stream in the garden. "Of course it'd be raining," said Edmund. They had just finished their breakfast with the professor and were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them, a long, low room with 2 windows looking out in one direction and 2 in another. "Stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. 10 to 1, it'll clear up in an hour or so, and in the meantime, we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books." "Not for me," said Peter. "I'm going to explore the house." Everyone agreed to this, and that was how the adventures began. It was the sort of house that you never seemed to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried led only to spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected they would. But soon they came to a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor. And after that was a room all hung with green, with a harp in one corner. Then came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then a kind of little upstairs hall and a door that led out into a balcony. and then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books, most of them very old books, and some bigger than a Bible in a church. And shortly after, they looked into a room that was quite empty, except for one big wardrobe. The sort that has a looking glass on the door. There was nothing else in the room at all, except a dead blue bottle on the windowsill. "Nothing in here," said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile to try the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt almost sure that it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There were nothing Lucy liked much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew it was very foolish to shut oneself into any wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found that there was a second row of coats hung up behind the first one. It was almost quite darker in here. She kept her arms stretched out in front of her so not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel woodwork against her fingertips, but she could not feel it. "This must be a simply enormous wardrobe," thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed that there was something crunching under her feet. "I wonder, is that more mothballs?" she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hand. But instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. "That's very odd," she said, and went a step or 2 further. Next moment, she found that was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. "Why, it's just like branches of trees!" exclaimed Lucy. Then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later, she found that she was standing in the middle of a wood at nighttime with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very curious and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe, and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew that it was very silly to shut oneself in a wardrobe. It seemed to still be daylight there. "I can always go back if anything goes wrong," thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood toward the other light. In about 10 minutes she reached it and found it was a lamppost. She stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood and wondering what to do next. She heard a little pitter-patter of feet coming toward her, and soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upward, he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet, he had goat's hooves. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice this at first because it was neatly caught up over his arm that held the umbrella, so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a large but pleasant little face, with a short, pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I've said, held the umbrella. In the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels in the snow, it looked just as if he had been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a fawn, and when he saw Lucy, he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all his parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the fawn. Chapter 2. What Lucy Found There. "Good evening," said Lucy, but the fawn was so busy picking up his parcels that at first it did not reply. When it had finished, it made her a little bow. Good evening," said the fawn. "Excuse me, I don't want to be inquisitive, but should I be right in thinking that you are a daughter of Eve?" "My name's Lucy," said she, not quite understanding him. "But you are, forgive me, you are what they call a girl?" asked the fawn. "Of course I'm a girl," said Lucy. "You are in fact human?" "Of course I'm human," said Lucy, still a little puzzled. To be sure," said the fawn. "How silly of me, but I've never seen a son of Adam or daughter of Eve before. I am delighted, that is to say," and then stopped, as if he had been going to say something it had not intended, but had remembered in time. Delighted, it went on. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tumnus." "I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy. "And may I ask, O Lucy, daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "how have you come into Narnia?" "Narnia? What's that?" said Lucy. "This is the land of Narnia," said the fawn. Where we are now, all that lies between the lamp-post and the great castle of Cair Paravel on the eastern sea. And you have come from the wild woods of the west?" I got in through the wardrobe in the spare room," said Lucy. "Ah," said Mr. Tumnus in a rather melancholy voice. "If only I had worked harder at geography when I was a little fawn, I should no doubt know all about those strange countries. It's too late for that now." "But they aren't countries at all," said Lucy, almost laughing. "It's only just back there, at least. I'm not sure. It's summer there."
Meanwhile," said Mr. Tumnus, "it's winter in Narnia, and has been for ever so long, and we shall both catch cold if we stand here talking in the snow. Daughter of Eve from the far land of Spare Oom, where eternal summer reigns round the bright city of Wardrobe, how would it be if you came and had tea with me?"
"Thank you very much, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy. "But I was wondering whether I ought to be getting back."
"Oh, it's only round the corner," said the fawn. "And there'll be a roaring fire, and toast, and sardines, and cake."
"Well, that is very kind of you," said Lucy, "but I shan't be able to stay long."
"If you'll only take my arm, daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "I shall be able to hold the umbrella over both of us. That's the way. Now off we go."
And so Lucy found herself walking through the wood arm in arm with this strange creature, as if they'd known each other their whole lives. They had not gone far before they came to a place where the ground became rough, and there were rocks all about, and little hills up and little hills down. At the bottom of one small valley, Mr. Tumnus turned suddenly aside, as if he were going to walk straight into an unusually large rock. But at the last moment, Lucy found he was leading her under into an entrance of a cave. As soon as they were inside, she found herself blinking in the light of the wood fire. Then Mr. Tumnus stooped and took a flaming piece of wood out of the fire with a neat little pair of tongs and lit a lamp.
"Now, we shan't be long," he said,
and immediately put a kettle on. Lucy thought she had never been in a nicer place. It was a little dry, clean cave of reddish stone with a carpet on the floor and two little chairs.
"One for me and one for a friend,"
said Mr. Tumnus. And a table and a dresser and a mantelpiece over the fire, and above that a picture of an old fawn with a gray beard. In one corner there was a door, which Lucy thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom, and on the other wall was a shelf full of books. Lucy looked at these while he was setting out the tea things. They had titles like The Life and Letters of Silenus, or Nymphs and Their Ways, or Men, Monks, and Gamekeepers, A Study in Popular Legend, or Is Man a Myth?
Now, Daughter of Eve, said the fawn.
And really, it was wonderful tea. There was a nice brown egg, lightly boiled, for each of them, and then sardines on toast, and then buttered toast, and then toast with honey, and then a sugar-topped cake. And when Lucy was tired of eating, the fawn began to talk. He had wonderful tales to tell of life in the forest. He told about the midnight dances and how the nymphs who lived in the wells and the dryads who lived in the trees came out to dance with the fawns. About long hunting parties and after milk-white stags who would give you wishes if you caught them, about feasting and treasure-seeking with the wild red dwarfs in deep mines and caverns far beneath the forest floor, and then about summer, when the woods were green and old Silenus on his fat donkey would come to visit them, and sometimes Bacchus himself. And then the streams would run with wine instead of water, and the whole forest would give itself up to jollification for weeks on end.
Not that it isn't always winter now,
he added gloomily. Then to cheer himself up, he took out from his case on the dresser a strange little flute that looked as if it were made of straw and began to play. And the tune he played made Lucy want to cry and laugh and dance and go to sleep all at the same time. It must have been hours later when she shook herself and said, "Oh, Mr. Tumnus, I'm so sorry to stop you, and I do love that tune, but really I must go home. I only meant to stay for a few minutes."
It's no good now, you know,
said the fawn, laying down his flute and shaking his head at her very sorrowfully. "No good?" said Lucy, jumping up and feeling rather frightened. What do you mean? I've got to go home at once. The others will be wondering what has happened to me." But a moment later she asked, "Mr. Tumnus, whatever is the matter?" For the fawn's brown eyes had filled with tears, and then the tears began trickling down his cheeks, and soon they were running off the end of his nose, and at last it covered his face with his hands and began to howl. "Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy in great distress. Don't, what is the matter? Aren't you well? Dear Mr. Tumnus, do tell me what's wrong." But the fawn continued sobbing as if his heart would break. And even when Lucy went over and put her arms around him and lent him her handkerchief, he did not stop. He merely took the handkerchief and kept on using it, wringing it out with both hands whenever it got too wet to use anymore, so that presently Lucy was standing in a damp patch. "Mr. Tumnus," bawled Lucy in his ear, shaking him, "do stop at once. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, a great big fawn like you. What on earth are you crying about?"
Oh, sobbed Mr. Tumnus. "I'm crying because I'm such a bad fawn."
"I don't think you're a bad fawn at all," said Lucy. "I think you're a very good fawn. You're the finest fawn I've ever met."
Oh, you wouldn't say that if you knew," replied Mr. Tumnus between sobs. "No, I'm a bad fawn. I don't suppose there ever was a worse fawn since the beginning of the world."
"But what have you done?" asked Lucy.
"My old father now," said Mr. Tumnus. "That's his picture of the mantelpiece. He would never have done a thing like this."
"A thing like what?" Lucy asked.
"Like what I've done," said the fawn. "Taken service under the White Witch. That's what I am. I'm in the pay of the White Witch."
"The White Witch? Who is she?"
"Why, it's she that's got all of Narnia under her thumb. It's she that makes it always winter and never Christmas. Think of that."
"How awful," said Lucy. "But what does she pay you for?"
"That's the worst of it," said Mr. Tumnus with a deep groan. "I'm a kidnapper for her. That's what I am. Look at me, Daughter of Eve. Would you believe that I'm the sort of fawn to meet a poor innocent child of the wood, one that had never done me any harm, and pretend to be friendly with it, and invite it home to my cave, for the sake of lulling it to sleep, then handing it over to the White Witch?
No, said Lucy. I'm sure you wouldn't do anything of the sort.
But I have, said the Fawn.
Well, said Lucy, rather slowly, for she wanted to be truthful and yet not too hard on him. Well, that is pretty bad, but you're so sorry for it that I'm sure you'll never do it again.
Daughter of Eve, don't you understand, said the Fawn. It isn't something I have done. I'm doing it now, at this very moment.
What do you mean? Cried Lucy, turning very white.
You are the child, said Mr. Tumnus. I had orders from the White Witch. If I ever saw a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve in the wood, I was to catch them and hand them over to her. And you are the first I've ever met. And I've pretended to be your friend and asked you to tea, and all the time I've been meaning to wait until you were asleep, then go and tell her.
But you won't, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. You won't, will you? Indeed, you really mustn't.
And if I don't, said he, beginning to cry again, she's sure to find out. And she'll have my tail cut off, and my horns saw off, and my beard plucked out, and she'll wave her wand over my beautiful cloven hooves, and turn them into horrid solid hooves, like a wretched horse's. And if she is extra and specially angry, she'll turn me into stone, and I shall be only a statue of a fawn in her horrible house, until the 4 thrones at Cair Paravel are filled, and goodness knows when that will happen, or whenever it will happen to us at all.
I'm very sorry, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy, but please let me go home.
Of course I will, said the Fawn. Of course I've got to. I see that now. I hadn't known that humans were like before I met you. Of course I can't give you up to the witch. Not now that I know you. But we must be off at once. I'll see you back to the lamppost. I suppose you can find your own way back to the spare and wardrobe?
I'm sure I can, said Lucy.
We must go as quietly as we can, said Mr. Tumnus. The whole wood is full of her spies. Even some of the trees are on her side.
They both got up and left the tea things on the table, and Mr. Tumnus once more put up his umbrella and gave Lucy his arm, and they went out into the snow. The journey back was not at all like the journey to the Fawn's cave. They stole along as quickly as they could, without speaking a word, and Mr. Tumnus kept to the dark places. Lucy was relieved when they reached the lamppost again.
Do you know your way from here, Daughter of Eve?
Said Tumnus. Lucy looked very hard between the trees, and could just see in the distance a patch of light that looked like daylight. Yes, she said, I can see the wardrobe door.
Then be off, and as quick as you can, said the Fawn. Can you ever forgive me for what I meant to do?
Why, of course I can, said Lucy, shaking him heartily by the hand. And I do hope you won't get into dreadful trouble on my account.
Farewell, Daughter of Eve, he said. Perhaps I may keep the handkerchief?
Rather, said Lucy, and then ran toward the far-off patch of daylight as quickly as her legs could carry her. And presently, instead of rough branches brushing past her, she felt the coats, and instead of crunching snow, under her feet she felt wooden boards. And all at once she found herself jumping out of the wardrobe into the same empty room from which the whole adventure had started. She shut the wardrobe door tightly behind her and looked around, panting for breath. It was still raining, and she could hear voices of the others in the passage. I'm here, she shouted. I'm here, I've come back, I'm all right. All right, everyone, let's discuss our first 2 chapters of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So our first chapter was titled Lucy Looks into a Wardrobe. Where did the children live before this story began? Do you remember? They lived in London. Now, if you've seen the movie version of this, which came out early 2000s, it goes a little bit more into this whole process. So in World War II, and this is a real thing in history, in World War II, during the air raids in London, they sent children out into the country to different homes and places so they wouldn't be in the war zone of what happened. So they get a little bit more into it in the movie, in which you see them, going through an air raid. It's very scary, and their mom sends them out to this professor's house. Why was Edmund bad-tempered the first night at the professor's house? Why do you think? Well, he was tired and kind of hungry. Do you ever find that when you're tired, you have a little bit shorter fuse when you're upset? It happens to the best of us. So he was tired. How did all of these adventures begin? What were they doing at the house when it began? All 4 kids were walking around and exploring this huge, really cool house that they're now staying in. And they went into this room and saw a wardrobe, and Lucy opened the door and just looked in. She wanted to touch the fur coats and found Narnia. What first made Lucy realize that something odd was happening in the wardrobe? Well, as she's feeling back there, she doesn't feel like the back of the wardrobe. So a wardrobe, maybe you don't have one of these. I have a closet, I don't have a wardrobe, but it's a big, kind of closet that's outside. So it looks kind of like this, really big, and has doors, and you would be able to feel the back of it. Well, while she's going in there and kind of feeling the coats and stuff, she never feels the back and starts feeling prickly, like pine trees and snow. Snow's not supposed to be in a wardrobe. So, what did Lucy think that convinced her that it was safe to go on in and explore the wardrobe? Do you remember? So she turned around and could see the light in the room. So she could still see the light in the room because she propped the door open, and she saw some light ahead. So she thought she could always go back if anything goes wrong. She's fine. What was the source of the light in the wood, in the forest? It was a lamppost. Right there. I love that there's just a lamppost in the middle of this forest. So I have 2 questions to make us think. So with this book, we're going to have a couple questions that make us think. What is your first impression of each child's personality? So there are 4 kids, right? The oldest is Peter, then Susan, then Edmund, then Lucy. So what are your first impressions of each child's personality? Think about that. Some of the things that we've heard about them from this story so far. Well, my first impression of Peter is he's definitely one to take charge, right? He likes to kind of be the leader. I mean, he is the oldest, that helps. Susan might act a little bit like the mother since she's not there right now and wants to take care and also kind of wants to take charge. Edmund seems like he can be a little bit of a pain sometimes, doesn't he? I think he definitely wants his own way, though. You know, that happens. And Lucy seems very curious, doesn't she? She always wants to know what's going on and seeing what's happening. My other thinking question is, what do you think about Lucy's decision to enter the woods alone? Do you think it was safe, brave, foolish? Why do you think that? I think it was brave, but also not the smartest thing. It's not the best idea to go searching through somewhere that you don't know, right? That could be dangerous. Maybe she should have gone back and gotten one of her siblings first. Brave because she, wanted to find this new world and things, but maybe I'm just not that brave. If I found World in the Wardrobe, definitely cool. Probably would have waited for a friend. All right, let's talk about chapter 2, which was titled What Lucy Found There. So what does Mr. Tumnus's phrase, daughter of Eve, mean? Well, if you have gone to Sunday school or done anything church-related, the two first humans in the Bible are named Adam and Eve. And so he is just referring to them being human, not a fawn like him with goat legs, or a witch like the White Witch, or a dwarf. He asks many different things, doesn't he? How did the fawn convince Lucy to come to his cave? He talked about having a nice tea and warming her up and having some cakes. Yeah, I probably would have gone too. They were standing out in the snow. He had warm stuff. How did Mr. Tumnus entertain her after they had eaten? He got out a little flute and started playing. He played some really beautiful music that made Lucy feel a lot of things, like she was happy and sad and sleepy and also excited all at the same time. What happened, though, when Lucy said she had to go? Mr. Tumnus got really upset, didn't he? What did he do? He said that he was going to be a really bad fawn, and he was going to take her to the White Witch, who is evil and makes it always winter all the time in Narnia. And he was supposed to take any human that he found, boy or girl, he was supposed to take them to her. But he had never met her before, and she was such a nice person, and so he felt really bad. What did he fear would happen to him if he failed to take Lucy to the witch? Lots of things, sadly. There were a couple different things. She would wave her wand, and what would she do to him? She would pull out his beard. She would hurt his hooves. She would turn him into stone. Oh boy, lots of bad things. Why did he decide not to take Lucy to the witch? Because she was such a nice, kind person. She didn't, she was understanding, I guess. He didn't want any harm to come to her, and he ended up being a good guy too. And so he didn't want her to get hurt from the witch. All right, we have a couple thinking questions. You ready? Why do you think Lucy felt comfortable in Mr. Tumnus's cave, which was his house? Well, it seemed very pleasant, right? They talked about how nice and cozy it was. I found a picture. And how he made her a nice tea. And they talked all about different things in Narnia. And he was very kind to her. Why do you think it took Lucy so long to understand the danger she was in? I'm just thinking that she's a very trusting person, and she likes to see the best in people. And so she saw all the nice things that Mr. Tumnus had done for her, so she didn't believe that he would do these bad things. What do you think about her behavior toward Mr. Tumnus after he told her that he was going to take her to the White Witch? So he told her, and then suddenly she almost felt bad for him, right? Because he was really scared. I think it also helped him make that decision that he wasn't going to turn her in. I think her kindness and understanding was very helpful. I probably would have ran out of there screaming, and that probably wouldn't have ended well. So, good for Lucy. All right, that is all our discussion for today. We are going to keep going with the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in our next video. We hope to see you there. Bye, everyone.